the shadow of the well. The silence was the loudest sound in Sara's small, earth-walled home. It pressed in on her, heavier than the coarse blanket she clutched, a constant echo of the moment the shouting had stopped, and a different, terrible quiet had fallen over the village. John, her John, was gone, swallowed by the crumbling well on the far edge of old Master Boren's land. The well! Even the name tasted like ash in her mouth. For months, John and other men had spoken of its danger, the loose stones, the rotting timbers. They had approached Boren, a man whose heart seemed as barren as his rockiest fields, begging him to repair it. He had waved them away, his eyes glittering with a cold dismissal, muttering about costs and lazy workers. Now, that well was a fresh wound in the village and in Sara's soul. John had been her warmth, her laughter, the sturdy tree against which she leaned. He worked their small plot of land with hands that were calloused but gentle, and his eyes, when they looked at her and their two small children, 7-year-old Leah and 5-year-old Tom, held a universe of love. Now, those hands were still, those eyes closed forever. Sara looked at Leah, who sat unnaturally still, her small face pale, tracing patterns in the dust on the floor. Tom, too young to grasp the enormity of it all, whimpered softly in his sleep, his small fist curled near his tear-stained cheek. A fresh wave of desolation washed over Sara. They were alone, adrift in a world that had suddenly turned sharp and cold. Their small plot of land, barely enough to sustain them even with John's tireless labor, now felt like an impossible burden. Master Boren had not even offered a word of condolence. He owned most of the land, and his influence was a suffocating blanket over the village. Fear was the currency he dealt in, and the villagers, though their eyes held pity for Sara, kept their distance. No one wanted to draw Boren's ire. Sara had always been known for her quiet kindness, a shared cup of milk for a neighbor's sick child, a patient ear for an old woman's tales, a gentle word for even the stray dogs that wandered the dusty paths. It was her nature, as steady and unassuming as the wildflowers that pushed through the cracks in the dry earth. But now, her kindness felt like a fragile thing, easily crushed. The shadow of that well, and the man who owned it, stretched long and dark over her small family. The future was a terrifying void, and the simple dignity of a livelihood, the basic hope for her children's next meal, felt like a distant, fading star. Yet, even as grief threatened to drown her, a tiny, stubborn ember of resilience flickered within. For Leah, for Tom, she had to find a way. Whispers from the past days bled into a monotonous cycle of grief and quiet desperation. Sara moved through her small home and the parched garden like a ghost, the vibrant colors of her life muted to a dull ache. Leah, usually a chatterbox, was now a small, watchful shadow, her eyes old with an understanding that wrenched Sara's heart. Tom, missing his father's playful roughhousing, would often look towards the door, his lower lip trembling, a silent question in his innocent gaze. The small tasks of survival, fetching water from the communal well, a safer one, thankfully, coaxing a few withered vegetables from their dry plot, mending clothes, became monumental efforts. Her beauty, once a simple fact of her being, now felt like a spotlight in her sorrow. She caught the speculative glances of men when she ventured out, and the pitying, sometimes wary, looks of the women. It wasn't long before Master Boren made his presence felt. He didn't come himself, of course. He sent one of his loyal men, a burly fellow with shifty eyes named Cale. Cale ambled up to her gate one afternoon, his voice a low, oily rumble. "Mistress Sara," he began, a false sympathy dripping from his tone. "Master Boren sends his regrets. A terrible accident. Terrible." He paused, letting his gaze linger a moment too long. He understands your hardship. He's a generous man, you know. He might be willing to take your land off your hands. For a fair price, of course. Save you the trouble. Sara felt a chill despite the afternoon sun. This land was John's, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm. It is my children's. Kyle shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. As you wish. But a woman alone with little ones. It's a hard life. Master Barren also thought perhaps a strong husband would be a help. He has several good men, loyal men. The implication hung heavy in the air, suffocating. Sara's hand tightened on the doorframe. Thank Master Barren for his concern, she managed, her throat tight. But I am not looking to sell, nor to marry. Cale's eyes narrowed slightly before he forced another smile. Think on it, mistress. His generosity has its limits. He turned and sauntered away, leaving behind an unspoken threat that coiled in the pit of Sara's stomach. That evening, as the children slept, Sara felt the walls closing in. The weight of Barren's words, the fear for her children's future, the crushing loneliness. It was almost too much to bear. She found herself tidying John's few belongings, his worn work shirt, his favorite carving knife. Her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard beneath their sleeping mat, one John had always meant to fix. Absently, she pried it up. Tucked beneath, wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth, was a small leather pouch. It was heavy for its size. With trembling hands, she untied the drawstring. Inside, nestled amongst dried leaves, were seeds, dark, smooth, and unfamiliar. Attached to the pouch was a small, stiff piece of parchment. In John's careful, slightly uneven handwriting were 3 words. For the future. A sob escaped Sara's lips, a sound torn from the depths of her being. John. Even in death, he was trying to provide for them. She had no idea what these seeds were, or if they would even grow in their poor soil, especially with the rain so late this year. But as she cradled the pouch in her hands, a tiny, fragile warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't much, just a handful of unknown seeds and a message of love. But in the vast darkness of her despair, it was a whisper from the past, a fragile glimmer of hope. The unseen siege. Kyle's visit was not an isolated incident. The pressure from Master Barren began to tighten around Sara like an invisible vice. He didn't send Kale again. Instead, subtler, more insidious tactics began. The miller, a man heavily indebted to Barren, suddenly found fault with the small sack of grain Sara brought, offering her a pittance for it, barely enough to buy a thin loaf of bread. The woman who usually sold her goat's milk at a fair price abruptly claimed her goat had run dry, though Sara had seen it full uddered just the day before. Then came the whispers. They followed her like flies buzzing just out of reach. Poor Sara, some would murmur, loud enough for her to hear. A widow alone. She'll lose that land for sure. Others, bolder and crueler, fueled by Barren's tacit approval, would say, perhaps she should take one of Barren's men. A woman needs a protector. Her beauty, once a quiet gift, now felt like a target painted on her back. The path to the communal well, once a place for quiet greetings and shared burdens, became a gauntlet of averted eyes and hurried steps. Women who had once shared smiles and scraps of news now found urgent tasks elsewhere when Sara approached. The children, too, felt the chill. Leah came home one day, her small face clouded, reporting that her usual playmates had run off when she joined them, whispering Barren's name. The village lived under a constant, unspoken fear of the landowner. His displeasure could mean ruin, a lost lease, a called-in debt, a sudden misfortune that no one would dare question. And Sara, by resisting his generous offers, was inviting that displeasure. Her quiet dignity was interpreted as stubbornness, her grief as an inconvenient obstacle to Barren's desires. To compound her woes, the rains, already late, showed no sign of arriving. The sky remained a merciless, brassy blue. The earth in her small garden grew harder each day, cracking like old leather. The few remaining vegetables withered on their stalks, and the water level in the communal well dropped steadily. A creeping anxiety for the coming months gnawed at Sara. How would she feed Leah and Tom if nothing grew? Master Barren himself made an appearance one sweltering afternoon. He didn't deign to enter her small yard, but stood by the dilapidated fence, his portly figure casting a long shadow. His eyes, small and shrewd, scanned her property, lingering on the struggling plants, then on Sara herself. "Mistress Sara," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "I hear you're finding things difficult. The land is unforgiving, especially for a woman alone. My offer to buy still stands. Or, if you prefer, my man Cale is strong. He would take good care of you and the children." He paused, a hint of steel entering his tone. It would be wise to accept. Some situations one cannot fight. Sara stood straight, her hands clasped before her, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Master Barren," she replied, her voice low but clear. "This land is all I have left of my husband. It is for my children. I will not sell it, and I will not be bartered like property." A flicker of annoyance crossed Barren's face. "Stubbornness is a poor companion in hard times, mistress. You will find yourself very much alone." He gave a curt nod and turned away, leaving Sara trembling, not from fear alone, but from a burgeoning sense of outrage. She was indeed alone. The siege was unseen, fought with whispers and turned backs, with implied threats and the slow, crushing weight of isolation. But within her, something hardened. John's seeds, hidden away, felt like the only secret she possessed, the only shield against the encroaching despair, a prayer in parched earth. The nights were the hardest. When Leah and Tom were finally asleep, their small breaths soft and even in the oppressive silence, Sara would sit by the dying embers of the fire, the weight of the world pressing down on her. Master Barren's words echoed in her mind. "You will find yourself very much alone." He was right. The village had become a landscape of closed doors and averted gazes. The path to the communal well was a daily reminder of her isolation. Her meager supplies dwindled. The children's faces were thinner, their laughter less frequent. Tom would sometimes cry from hunger, a sound that tore at Sara's soul more fiercely than any threat from Barren. Each pang of their hunger was a fresh temptation to yield, to sell the land that was her only link to John, or worse, to accept the protection of one of Barren's men. A fate that felt like a betrayal of everything she and John had built, however humble. She would look at her calloused hands, hands that knew hard work, hands that had once held John's with such love. Could she truly condemn her children to this slow starvation out of pride? Was her integrity worth their suffering? The questions tormented her, gnawing at her resolve. One evening, Cale appeared again, not at her gate, but on the path as she returned from a fruitless search for edible wild greens. He blocked her way, his bulk imposing. "Still stubborn, Mistress Sara?" He sneered, his eyes lingering on the hollows in her cheeks. "Master Barren is a patient man, but even his patience wears thin. The children look hungry. A word from you, and they could be eating well tonight." Sara clutched her empty basket. The image of Leah and Tom, their eyes wide with hunger, flashed before her. For a terrifying moment, she wavered. The path of least resistance seemed so easy, so tempting. But then she remembered John's face, his unwavering belief in honest work, in dignity. She thought of the seeds, his last gift, his hope. For the future. "My children will eat," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "From the work of my own hands on my own land. Tell Master Barren I have nothing more to say to him." Kale spat on the ground. "Foolish woman, you'll starve with your pride." He pushed past her, leaving her shaken but strangely resolute. That night, under the cold light of a sliver moon, Sara made her decision. The drought showed no signs of breaking. The earth was cracked and hostile. Logic told her it was a fool's errand, but she had nothing left but John's seeds and a desperate, flickering faith. She took the small leather pouch from its hiding place. The seeds felt cool and smooth in her palm. She carried them out to the small, barren plot behind her cottage, the land John had tilled with such care. The ground was so hard she had to use the tip of John's old hunting knife to break the surface, her hands aching with the effort. For each seed, she whispered a prayer for rain, a prayer for strength, a prayer for her children. It was an act of defiance against Barren, against the drought, against the despair that threatened to consume her. She didn't know if anything would grow. She didn't know if this small act would change anything. But as she pressed the last seed into the unyielding earth, a profound sense of peace settled over her. She had chosen her path. She would face the future, however bleak, with her integrity intact, sustained by this one final act of hope, a prayer buried in the parched earth, the first green shoots of courage. Days turned into a week, then two, under the relentless, uncaring sun. Sara continued her daily struggle, rationing their dwindling food, her heart heavy with a quiet dread. She watered the spots where she'd planted John's seeds with the last dregs from her water pail each evening, a ritual born more of habit and a stubborn refusal to entirely give up than any real expectation. The earth remained stubbornly barren, cracked and dusty. Master Barren's man, Kyle, would sometimes pass by her fence, a knowing smirk on his face as he surveyed her parched land. Each smirk was a small, sharp stab. One morning, after a restless night filled with anxious dreams, Sara rose before dawn. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of dust. She went out to the small plot, more to escape the confines of the silent cottage than anything else. Her eyes, accustomed to the unchanging barrenness, swept over the ground. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the pale light, a phantom conjured by her desperate hope. But as she knelt, her breath catching in her throat, she saw it clearly. A tiny speck of green, no bigger than her smallest fingernail, pushing its way determinedly through a crack in the dry earth. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, barely daring to touch it. It was real. Her gaze darted around. There was another and another, small, determined points of emerald against the dun-colored soil. They were not like any seedlings she knew. They looked sturdy, their leaves a deep, vibrant green, almost waxy, as if designed to hoard every precious drop of moisture. A sob, raw and unexpected, escaped her. It wasn't a sob of grief this time, but of an overwhelming, almost painful relief. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto the thirsty ground near the tiny shoots. It was a miracle. In this forgotten, cursed patch of land, under a sky that had forgotten how to weep, John's seeds, his whisper from the past, had taken root. She spent the morning simply watching them, as if they might vanish if she looked away. Leah and Tom, woken by her unusual stillness, came to find her. "Mama, what is it?" Leah asked, her voice small. Sara gathered them close, pointing with a trembling finger. "Look," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Look what Papa left for us." The children peered at the tiny green specks. Tom, ever curious, reached out a tentative finger. "A baby plant?" he asked. "Yes, my love," Sara said, a genuine smile, the first in weeks, touching her lips. "A baby plant, many of them, Papa's gift." These were not just plants. They were courage made visible. They were the first fragile answer to her prayer in the parched earth. They were a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not entirely alone, not entirely defeated. The fight was far from over. The drought still held the land in its grip, and barren's shadow still loomed. But as Sara looked at those tiny green shoots, a new kind of strength, fragile yet tenacious, began to unfurl within her, mirroring the life bursting forth from the dry soil. Hope, she realized, could be as resilient as these unexpected seedlings, a taste of a new season. The tiny green shoots became the center of Sara's world. Every morning, before the sun climbed too high and baked the earth, she was out in the small plot, her shadow long beside her. She loosened the soil around each delicate stem with her fingers, clearing away any stray pebbles or encroaching weeds that dared compete for the scarce moisture. She used her own meager water ration carefully, giving each plant just enough to survive, her heart aching that she could not offer more. The plants seemed to thrive on her care, or perhaps on some innate hardiness John must have known they possessed. They grew with a surprising speed, their leaves unfurling thick and glossy, a vibrant, defiant green against the surrounding desolation. They were unlike anything Sara, or indeed anyone in the village, had ever seen. They didn't sprawl like pumpkin vines, nor did they reach for the sky like beanstalks. They grew sturdy and upright, their stems surprisingly robust. Leah and Tom became her devoted assistants. Leah, with a newfound seriousness, would report on the progress of each plant, noting new leaves or an increase in height. Tom, less meticulous, but equally enthusiastic, would chase away any curious insects, his small voice chattering encouragement to the papa plants. Their involvement brought a lightness to the task, a shared purpose that had been missing from their lives for too long. Then, one sun-drenched afternoon, as Sara gently brushed dust from a leaf, she saw them. Small, tight buds nestled where the leaves joined the stem. Her heart gave a joyful leap. Buds meant flowers, and flowers, if they were fortunate, meant fruit. The days that followed were filled with a quiet anticipation. The buds swelled, then slowly unfurled into blossoms of a startling deep crimson, their color so rich it seemed to draw light into itself. They were beautiful, but more importantly, they held the promise of sustenance. And then, the fruit began to form. Small at first, like green marbles, they swelled and ripened with astonishing speed, changing from green to a deep, burnished orange, then finally to a luminous, almost jewel-like red. They were plump and heavy, their skin smooth and glowing with an inner vitality. The day Sara decided the first fruit was ready, she gathered Leah and Tom around the plant. With a reverence usually reserved for prayer, she gently twisted the fruit from its stem. It came away easily, leaving a sweet, unfamiliar scent in the air. She held it in her palm, a perfect, vibrant globe of color. "This," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is for us. From Papa." She took John's old knife and carefully sliced the fruit in half. The flesh inside was a brilliant, juicy orange, studded with tiny black seeds. She cut a small piece for Leah, one for Tom, and one for herself. Leah bit into hers, her eyes widening. "Mama," she exclaimed, juice dripping down her chin. "It's so sweet, and a little bit tangy." Tom, his mouth full, could only nod enthusiastically, his face a picture of pure delight. Sara tasted her piece. It was unlike anything she had ever eaten. Sweet, yes, but with a complex, refreshing tartness and a deep, satisfying flavor that seemed to quench not just thirst, but a deeper hunger. It tasted of sunshine, of resilience, of hope. The harvest, when it came, was small by grander standards, but for Sara, it was a bounty. Basket after basket of the vibrant, glowing fruit filled her small cottage. their rich color a stark contrast to the drabness of her surroundings. Her little plot of land, once a symbol of her despair, was now an oasis of vivid green leaves and crimson-red fruit. It looked alive, vibrant, a testament to her perseverance and John's foresight. The land was beginning to change, and with it, the taste of their season, from bitter hardship to the first sweet notes of a new beginning. The blooming shield. The sight of Sara's land, transformed from a patch of withered hopes into a vibrant tapestry of green and crimson, did not go unnoticed. Her small plot, tucked away at the edge of the village, was suddenly an anomaly in a landscape increasingly dominated by the pale, thirsty browns of the ongoing drought. The brilliant red of the fruit, clustered thickly on the sturdy plants, was like a beacon. At first, it was just furtive glances from those who passed by on the dusty track. Then came the lingering looks. Children, drawn by the incredible color, would stop at her dilapidated fence, their eyes wide with wonder. Sara, busy tending her precious crop, would sometimes offer a small, slightly bruised fruit, and watch their faces light up with the same delight Leah and Tom had shown. The news of Sara's miraculous harvest began to spread through the village, carried on the same currents of whispers that had once condemned her. But now the tone was different. Fear was still present, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was tinged with something new. Curiosity, disbelief, and even a reluctant admiration. "Have you seen Sara's land?" they'd ask in hushed tones. "Fruits like jewels, they say, and so many of them, even with no rain." One afternoon, as Sara was carefully picking the ripened fruit, she felt a presence. Kyle, Master Boren's man, stood by the fence, his usual smirk replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He stared at the bounty before him, at the healthy, laden plants, then at Sara, who met his gaze calmly. Where did these plants come from?" he stammered, his bravado momentarily gone. "They are a gift," Sara replied simply, her voice even. "From my husband." Kyle grunted, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process this unexpected turn. This self-sufficient widow, with a crop that seemed to defy the drought, was not part of Boren's plan. He turned and walked away, more thoughtfully than before. Master Boren himself did not appear, but Sara knew he would have heard. The sheer, undeniable productivity of her land had become a shield. How could he argue she was incapable of managing it when it was visibly flourishing while his own vast fields struggled under the dry spell? How could he pressure her with poverty when baskets of rich, vibrant fruit were piling up in her cottage? The fruit itself was a marvel. It was not only delicious, but seemed to possess a remarkable ability to quench thirst and provide energy. Sara found that she and the children needed less water after eating it, and their hunger was more easily satisfied. She began to trade a few fruits for other necessities, a little flour from the miller, who was now surprisingly polite, a needle and thread from a traveling peddler. Each small transaction was a victory, a step away from complete dependence. The women of the village were the most intrigued. They saw Sara, still a widow, still alone, but no longer looking defeated. They saw her children, their cheeks a little fuller, their eyes brighter. They saw the land, her land, blooming defiantly. The fear of Boren was still strong, but the sight of Sara's success planted a different kind of seed in their minds, a seed of wonder, perhaps even a tiny seed of hope for themselves. The land, John's legacy, was not just providing sustenance. It was subtly shifting the air around Sara, creating a small, protected space where her dignity could thrive. Her quiet, persistent work was becoming her most potent defense. Seeds of community. With each passing day, Sara's connection to the mysterious plants deepened. She wasn't just a tender of them. She was becoming their student. She observed how they responded to the scant watering, how their leaves seemed to curl slightly in the hottest part of the day to conserve moisture, then unfurl again in the cooler evening. She learned the exact shade of red that indicated peak ripeness and the subtle fragrance that accompanied it. Curiosity led her to experiment. She found that the fruit, when sliced thinly and dried in the sun, became a chewy, intensely flavored treat that lasted for weeks. The children loved these sun candies. She tried crushing some of the pulp and found it made a refreshing, slightly tangy drink when mixed with a little water. It seemed to soothe Tom's occasional coughs, and Leah claimed it helped her feel less tired after playing. Sara began to feel a quiet pride in her growing knowledge. This wasn't just luck. It was understanding, an intimacy with the life she nurtured. Her shoulders, once perpetually slumped with worry, straightened a little more each day. The haunted look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a calm watchfulness, the look of someone who knew her own worth. The first woman to approach was Alara, a timid soul whose husband worked one of Boren's poorest fields. Alara had watched Sara from afar for weeks, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fascination. One morning, she appeared at Sara's fence, clutching a small, worn basket. "Sara," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze darting around as if expecting Boren himself to materialize. Your fruit. It is truly a marvel." Sara offered a gentle smile. "It is a blessing, Alara. My little boy, he has been so listless with the heat, and there is so little to offer." Alara's voice trailed off, her eyes fixed on the vibrant red globes hanging from the plants. Without hesitation, Sara picked a perfectly ripe fruit. "Take this for him," she said. "And these." She carefully selected a few more. "They are good for thirst." Alara's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Sara, I have nothing to trade." "No trade is needed, Alara," Sara said softly. "Share what you can, when you can. That is enough." Alara left, clutching the fruit as if it were precious jewels, her gratitude palpable. A few days later, another woman, Martha, older and more outspoken, but whose family was also struggling, came by. "Sara," she said more directly, "those plants of yours, they're a miracle. Did he tell you how to grow them?" Sara explained about the seeds, John's message, and her desperate act of faith. She shared what she had learned about their care, their need for sun, and their surprising resilience to drought. "And the seeds from the fruit?" Martha asked, her eyes keen. "Can they be planted?" Sara had wondered this herself. She had saved some of the tiny black seeds from the fruit they ate. "I believe so," she said. "I plan to try. If you have any to spare," Martha said, her voice dropping. "I have a small patch behind my house. It is dry as bone, but perhaps—" Sara looked at Martha, then at Alara, who had returned, standing a little straighter this time, a hopeful light in her eyes. She saw in them the same anxieties and hopes that had filled her own heart. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. She went into her cottage and returned with a small handful of the dried black seeds. "Take these," she said, dividing them between the two women. "Plant them with hope. Talk to them. They seem to like it." A small smile touched her lips, and for the first time in a long time, she heard the echo of her own quiet laughter. Martha and Alara looked at the seeds in their palms as if they were gold dust. It was a small gesture, but in the oppressive atmosphere of the village, it felt like an act of quiet rebellion. Sara wasn't just sharing fruit. She was sharing knowledge. She was sharing hope. The first fragile threads of community, woven from shared hardship and a common desire for something better, were beginning to form around Sara and her miraculous plants. The seeds of change were being sown, not just in the earth, but in the hearts of women. For hours, the quiet revolution takes root. The seeds Sara shared with Alara and Martha were indeed planted with hope. And, just as on Sara's land, tiny green shoots soon pushed through the parched earth in their small, neglected garden plots. The news spread like wildfire, though still in hushed tones, away from the ears of Master Barren or his men. More women, emboldened by Alara and Martha's fledgling success, began to approach Sara. Some came with a small offering, a handful of hoarded beans, a mended piece of cloth, a promise of help with Sara's children. Others came with nothing but the desperate hope in their eyes. Sara, remembering her own darkest days, shared what she could, a few precious seeds, advice on nurturing the plants, and always a word of quiet encouragement. Her small yard became an informal meeting place, a haven where women gathered not to gossip in fear, but to exchange tips about the new crop, to marvel at its resilience, and to draw strength from one another. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the village began to change. Patches of vibrant green and crimson started to appear behind other cottages, small islands of abundance in the sea of drought-stricken land. These women, who had once felt so powerless, now had something of their own, something that Barren did not control. The fruit provided food for their families, a small surplus to trade for other essentials, and a measure of dignity they hadn't known before. They were less reliant on the whims of the landowner or the grudging charity of others. It was a subtle shift, but it was profound. The marketplace, once dominated by Barren's overpriced grain and the despairing faces of hungry villagers, saw a new, if modest, addition. Women would bring a few of the vibrant red fruits, carefully wrapped, to trade. The fruit was so unique, so thirst-quenching and nutritious, that it quickly found eager takers, even from neighboring hamlets where word of the miracle fruit had spread. The village economy, so long skewed by Barren's greed, began to find a new, healthier, if small, current. Sara herself became a figure of quiet respect. She sought no leadership, gave no grand speeches. Her power lay in her steadfastness, her generosity, and the undeniable success of her land. Her small plot was no longer just her shield. It was a beacon, a living testament to what was possible with courage and hard work. Villagers who had once averted their eyes now greeted her with a nod of recognition, sometimes even a shy smile. The children, Leah and Tom, no longer faced the sting of exclusion. They were Sara's children, the children of the woman who had brought the magic fruit. Master Barren watched this unfolding quiet revolution with a mixture of disbelief and impotent fury. He couldn't forbid people from planting seeds on their own small, allotted patches. He couldn't claim ownership of a plant he didn't understand and hadn't introduced. He sent Kale to grumble and threaten. But the women, drawing courage from their shared success and Sara's calm example, no longer cowered so easily. What could he do? Their small plots were blooming. Their children were eating. Barren's power had always been rooted in the villagers' dependence and fear. Now, with each new sprout, with each basket of fruit harvested independently, that dependence lessened. His influence wasn't being challenged by open confrontation. There were no angry mobs, no defiant speeches. Instead, it was being steadily, quietly eroded by the collective success of ordinary women, inspired by one widow's refusal to break. The roots of Sara's quiet revolution were sinking deep into the heart of the village, drawing life from the very earth he sought to control. Harvest of dignity. Years passed, seasons turned, and the landscape of the village, both literal and metaphorical, continued its slow, steady transformation. Sara's small plot of land remained the vibrant heart from which the new life had spread. Leah and Tom were growing tall and strong, their laughter echoing freely in a home no longer shadowed by immediate hunger or fear. John's memory was still a tender ache, but it was now overlaid with a profound sense of gratitude for the legacy he had unwittingly left behind. Not just the seeds, but the enduring strength he had nurtured in Sara. Sara herself was no longer the haunted widow. Lines of care and wisdom were etched around her eyes, but those eyes shone with a quiet confidence. She moved with a gentle authority, her hands, still calloused from work, now also adept at sharing knowledge, at comforting, at leading by quiet example. Her home was often filled with the murmur of women's voices, discussing not just the cultivation of the miracle fruit, now simply called Sara's gift by many, but also other small ventures, a weaving cooperative, a shared system for childcare. The seeds of community she had sown had blossomed into a resilient network of support. The village itself breathed easier. While Master Barren still owned much of the land, his power was no longer absolute. The fear that had once choked the air had lessened, replaced by a cautious optimism and a growing sense of self-reliance. Families were healthier, their small plots producing enough of Sara's gift to sustain them and trade for other needs. The silence of fear had given way to the hum of quiet industry and shared purpose. The well where John had died still stood as a somber reminder, but its shadow no longer defined their existence. Instead, the village looked to the countless patches of crimson and green that dotted the landscape as symbols of their newfound resilience. Master Barren, an older, more embittered man, was largely ignored. His threats carried little weight against the tangible success of the community's shared efforts. He had sought to control through fear and scarcity, but Sara, through courage and generosity, had shown them a path to abundance, however modest. The land, which Barren had seen merely as a resource to be exploited, had under Sara's patient hand and the collective care of the village women become a source of shared prosperity and dignity. One sunny afternoon, Sara stood looking out over her thriving land, Leah beside her. Now a young woman with her mother's kind eyes and her father's quiet strength. Tom was nearby, patiently showing a younger child how to tend a new seedling. Other women worked in their nearby plots, their voices carrying on the breeze a melody of shared work and contentment. Sara thought of John, of the despair that had once threatened to engulf her, of the tiny seeds he had labeled for the future. He could not have known the profound impact his humble gift would have. He could not have foreseen the quiet revolution it would spark. Leah slipped her hand into Sara's. "It's beautiful, Mama. What Papa left us has helped so many." Sara smiled, a deep, peaceful contentment settling in her heart. She looked at the flourishing land, at her healthy children, at the hopeful faces of her neighbors. She had faced hardship with integrity, met cruelty with kindness, and shared her unexpected blessings without hesitation. The journey had been arduous, marked by sorrow and struggle, but through it all, she had held on to her core values. The vibrant fruit glowed in the sun, a testament to patience, to honest work, and to the quiet strength of a noble heart. In the end, the simple truth echoed through the rustling leaves and the hopeful air of the transformed village. Goodness, however tested, however besieged, never truly goes unrewarded.